my name is Alexandra Baig, and you'll see my contact information on the last slide. And I have worked with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities for about 2 decades in a variety of capacities. For a number of years, I did run a small SILA provider agency in the Chicago area. I have also run an inclusive post-secondary program, but what I've done for most of my career is future planning. So I came at this with a finance background. I am a financial planner by trade and also a chartered, don't like the term, chartered special needs consultant. And I found 2 things over my decades of working with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. So the first thing I found that was when we look to the future to plan, the most requested assistance was around Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid benefits, right? So most of the clients came in and they said, yeah, I understand, or the parents said, yes, I understand retirement planning, and I understand that I should, put my 401k in different investments. That part I get. What I don't understand is why my son or daughter is getting a 16-page letter from Social Security telling them that their benefits have changed, right? So that was the first thing. The second thing that I learned as I went through helping families was that expectations were rising exponentially. So when I first started in this work, families had very modest expectations for their youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So the idea was you get through school, you age out of school, you go through transition, and for many families at that time, that long ago, the expectation was limited to, we're going to find a group home that's not too bad, and we're going to find a day program that's not too bad, right? Maybe a workshop type of thing, maybe a recreational type of thing. Since then, though, expectations have risen exponentially. Now, as we all know, students with disabilities and their families want jobs. And they don't want sort of part-time, volunteerish. Some of them would perhaps be good in that setting, but they want jobs. They want real jobs. They want jobs that pay money. They want jobs where they're contributing, right? And they want to live independently. They don't necessarily want to live in a group home. They want to live in an apartment. They want to live with their friends. Maybe they want to live with a romantic partner, right? So the challenge is that back in the day, when my expectations were very modest, benefits planning was also pretty modest too, because like Alan Bergman said, you take your child at the age of 18, you go to Social Security, you get them on SSI, then you get them on Medicaid, and they tick along like that, then mom and dad retires, you get them on DAC benefits, then you get them on Medicare, and everything just keeps chugging along because the person, now an adult, is living at a level of expectation where nobody argues that they have a disability, right? Now things are different. So we're going to walk through what happens when a student with a disability works at a significant level, how to manage maintaining those benefits, and what is the information that families and education, folks involved in education need to know to help that student through that complicated process. So we all know that employment is a key outcome for transition. Right? This is what we want at the federal level and the state level. It's written into the legislation. This is a goal, a stated goal of transition, right? Employment, right? Employment to the fullest extent that the student is capable. We also know, right, that the adult definition of having a disability, which is the eligibility criteria for various benefits, not just Social Security, that adult definition of having a disability hinges on a limited capacity to earn, right? That is written into the Social Security definition of having a disability. The person's conditions must make them unable to perform substantial gainful activity, which is defined for this year, 2025, as the ability to earn $1,620 a month gross, right? That's before any deductions, right? If they earn more than that, according to Social Security, guess what? They're not disabled, right? So, and this applies for Social Security, but it also trickles down to other related benefits, such as Medicaid, such as ride-free cards for your CTA, right? So, This creates a certain tension, right? So students want to secure employment, competitive integrated employment, maybe supported employment, right? But we know that many of our students will need to maintain some level of support for them to be successful in their adult lives, right? So students who are successful in their jobs may still need support in other areas of daily living, particularly when family members are no longer able to provide that support. Because I think family members generally vastly underestimate the amount of unpaid support that they are providing to their students around daily living, right? So now you're faced with the problem, and families are aware of this, that if their student earns too much money, this may jeopardize their access to those necessary adult services. So how do we work with this, right? Well, I'm not going to go through all of this in detail because starting with Alan Bergman and working forward, pretty much everybody has talked about this. We all know that people with disabilities are the most unemployed and or underemployed demographic of anyone, right? And within that group, the subcategory which has the worst end of the stick, right, are people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, people with, as we might say, higher support needs, right? So this is just a brief chart, right? Same thing everybody's presented, maybe slightly different figures from a slightly different source, right? So Social Security, and by derivation Medicaid, and Medicare, do have work incentives built into their regulatory structure, which can help students with disabilities work more while maintaining their benefits. But there's a challenge. First of all, students and their families don't always get correct information, including from Social Security, right? So I've had, people at Social Security say, well, be careful. If your student works too much, this could happen, right? The work incentives are complicated, right? People don't necessarily understand how to apply them or when to use them because they are not straightforward. As a result, some parents and guardians, and I've had this as of a couple years ago in the inclusive post-secondary program where a parent came to me and said, I do not want my daughter to get a paid job. Volunteer only. Paid employment was a goal of the inclusive post-secondary program. Her parents were paying close to $50,000 a year for her to attend a program, but they were uncomfortable with the possibility that she would achieve the objective goal of the program, right, which was paid employment. Why? Because they were concerned that if she didn't have Medicaid in the future, she wouldn't have waiver supports, and who would support her when they were unable to, right? And then with schools, and I do a lot of speaking at school districts too, school staff, it's not your job. Like, you all have vast information and knowledge about educating students with disabilities, about supporting them in their work-based learning, right? About the accommodations and modifications that you're making. You can't be expected to know everything, right? So you can't also be expected to understand or know the details of all of this, and that can make people, I don't want to give someone wrong information, right? So if somebody came to me with a special education question, I would feel uncomfortable answering it because I don't have that knowledge base. So also with the school, people in the schools may be reluctant to talk too much about that for fear of giving parents incorrect information. Right, so adding education about work incentives to the transition process can really be helpful because if you can relieve the anxiety that parents may have over that, you can really work forward towards those work goals, right? And we know, and we've heard most recently from the folks who are talking about the apprenticeship, we know that even students with significant disabilities can be successful at work. We know this. That's why we're all here, right? So having this education allows parents and school staff to balance those objectives of obtaining the employment, right, and also maintaining the benefits that they need. There has been research done on this, and I do have a short bibliography at the end. So there has been research done that providing benefits counseling to youth with disabilities does increase their rate of employment, right? So this is a useful component, particularly youth in transition, right? So we all know, again, I won't say this again because everyone from Alan Bergman on has said a version of this. We know the benefits of young adults with intellectual and developmental or any kind of disability working in an integrated setting, right? We know this. So let's move forward and talk about some of those work incentives. First thing I'm going to talk about is the ticket to work. Now, the ticket to work, while available to students while they're still in school and in transition, I would not recommend that students start using it at that time, but I am going to share about it with you so that you know that it's there for them as they're moving through. So anybody who receives SSI due to disability or SSDI, so Supplemental Security Income, SSI, or Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI, and those are two quite different things. But anyone who receives either one of those benefits automatically has a ticket to work. I understand way back in the day, they sent you a paper ticket in the mail. They don't do that anymore, it's in the computer, right? So basically, the ticket to work is a suite of services that Social Security pays for. They contract with entities to provide this, which are designed to either help people with disabilities go to work or return to work or increase their level of employment, right? Now, the reason I recommend that students wait till after they leave the school system to enter the ticket or to use their ticket is that once you start using your ticket, there are milestones you need to meet, and there is a clock running on that. So it's best, I think, if students avail themselves of all of the supports and services they have within the school system first, including something like that apprenticeship program, and then if they still need employment assistance after school, they open their ticket. But I'm still going to share it with you because it's important, because that way parents can understand that there are supports and services available to pick up where the school district leaves off. So what happens with the ticket to work is that an employment network, which could be a nonprofit entity, so certain adult service providers may be licensed or authorized as this. Sometimes it's even individuals, and also our good friends at the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation. They're all employment network providers. They help the person with a disability build an individual work plan, an IWP, which has the same sort of things you might expect. It has a stated work goal. It has the steps, right, that the person needs to take to get to that work goal. And while they are pursuing that plan, they are not required to undergo continuing disability review with regard to their benefits, right? So that's one of the positives of that. Plus, the employment network provides all of, or at least many of the services that you see. And again, this is at no cost to the ticket holder. Okay, so that's for after school. But there are Social Security work incentives and Medicaid, and if applicable, Medicare, that can be useful to the student while they're even still in school, still in transition, when they reach the step of paid employment, right? So the work incentives, generally speaking, are designed to take into account the fact that people with disabilities face additional barriers to employment, and they may apply to Supplemental Security Income, SSI, or Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI, or both, and they may apply to Medicare or Medicaid. And we all know, right, that Medicaid is really important to many of our students, because even if they don't need the cash benefits of SSI or SSDI because of their work income, and even if they don't really need the health insurance because they have that from a different source, Medicaid is the ultimate payer for the Medicaid waivers, which are the funding source for pretty much all adult services for people with intellectual developmental disabilities, and through DRS for other kinds of disabilities too. So in order to have those adult services, they need to remain Medicaid eligible. Okay, so we'll start with, does everybody know the difference between SSI and SSDI? Should I maybe, nope, okay. So SSI, Supplemental Security Income, is a benefit that's available to certain categories of people, people with disabilities and seniors mostly, and sometimes children, because they fit into that category and they have low income and few assets, right? So most students with disabilities, when they go at age 18 to apply for Social Security, they're going to be determined if Social Security agrees that, yes, they meet the definition of having a disability. They're going to be eligible for SSI because, right, they have a disability, and if you set things up correctly, they don't have much income because probably they're not working yet. Many of our 18-year-olds are not working very much. And if you set it up right, they don't have too many countable assets, right? We'll talk a little bit about what's countable and what's not, but so that's SSI. Maybe hold till the end if it's not too hard, so jot them down. Just so I will definitely leave time. So SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance, that is the benefit available to people with disabilities that is based on having a work history with Social Security, right? And I see some people nodding here. So that's the sort of benefit that if I walk out of here and get hit by a bus and then meet the Social Security definition of disability, that's the benefit I would get because I've been working, I've been paying my FICA taxes, and I have built up work credits with Social Security. In most cases, young adults still in the transition period do not qualify for SSDI. Why? Because they don't have the work credits. Now, it's too complicated to get into here, but it doesn't take a lot of work credits to be eligible for SSDI when you are a young person. So some of them possibly might, okay? Social Security will determine that as they go through the application process. But for SSI purposes, Supplemental Security Income, SSI purposes, the benefit that probably most of your students would be getting after they turn 18, here are some of the work incentives available. So the first one, which is really, really nice, is the student earned income exclusion, which is very large. So typically, with SSI, because SSI is a means-tested benefit, remember, you can't have too much income, right? What happens with SSI is if you do have income, it reduces how much SSI you can get. And the general rule of thumb is that unearned income reduces how much SSI you can get dollar for dollar, right? So if my bank pays me $10 in interest, that would reduce my SSI by $10. There's a few nuances, but that's basically the deal. Earned income reduces SSI by 50 cents on the dollar. Right? So typically, if I would earn $500 in the month, my SSI would be reduced by $250. Right? There's a few nuances there too. However, if you are a student under the age of 22, regularly attending school, and there's a definition of how many hours count as regularly, right? But that would, most transition students would fit that definition, right? There is a much higher limit. Students who fit that definition under 22, regularly attending school, can earn this year up to $2,350 a month and still keep their full SSI payment. That's a lot, right? That is a lot. Up to an annual amount of over $9,000, right? So for sure, when students are in transition and getting SSI, you have this safeguard, right? They can absolutely explore working for money and still keep their SSI. Note, once they turn 22, that gets shut off. It's a cliff, right? There's no age, it just stops, right? That provision is not applicable for students who are over the age of 22 or if they stop attending school regularly. So if they go through the apprenticeship program in year 1 of transition and then they go on to full-time work, they're no longer eligible for that earned income exclusion. However, there is a general earned income exclusion as well, right, which says that, right, so this is for people over the age of 22 or who are no longer in school, right, which says that for your earned income, the first $65 doesn't count. If you have no unearned income, it's the first $85. And then half of the rest of what you earn does not count. So for parents who say, well, I'm concerned if my student starts to work, they're going to lose their SSI. Yes, in the sense that their SSI will be reduced, but if you do the math, right, since only half of earned income counts for the reduction, they're going to be better off working than not working, right? Because they'll have all their income from work plus their reduced SSI benefit. And we'll go through some numbers to show how that works. Okay. These are other benefits that are work incentives that are available to people receiving SSI. So, as I said at the beginning, sometimes what students and parents are concerned about is not the loss of the cash benefit, because SSI's maximum payable this year is $967, right? So if you think your student has the potential to earn more than that, right, you may not be that concerned about the loss of cash, right? You may be clear that your student is better off working than not working, because $967 is not very much money, right? However, you may be concerned with their Medicaid eligibility, because again, that's where those adult services are going to come from, right? So there are provisions. So 1619A, which I won't go over a lot, does allow for a small amount of cash to continue to be paid to a person of any age who is working, getting SSI, and is exceeding the threshold that Social Security would normally say, if you exceed this threshold, you cease to be disabled. They can receive a small cash benefit. That's 1619A. But the big one is the second paragraph, 1619B. 1619B says that people who receive SSI and Medicaid together, and then they stop receiving SSI because of earned income, maintain their Medicaid eligibility, right? Now, there is an outside limit for 1619B, but it's quite high, right? So it's really important to reassure parents that, caveat, student needs to have Medicaid along with SSI prior to getting to that point of too much income, right? So as a result, I typically recommend that parents apply for SSI when their student turns 18, assuming they get approved, and if they can't get approved the first time, folks like me can help them. Once they get that approval, they immediately go, because it's not one process in Illinois like it is in other states, they immediately go and apply for Medicaid, even if they don't need Medicaid right now. Get the two of them together. Because then, when the student starts working and earning money, they will be eligible for this 1619B continuation, which is literally called in the Social Security regulations, Medicaid continuation for, quotes, special groups of former SSI recipients, right? So it's important, even if the family thinks that SSI is going to be short-lived because their student can work, and even if they think Medicaid is not something the student needs right now, have them get those two together. That sets the student up for future Medicaid continuation, right? Even if they don't, keep the SSI. Okay. And then this one, I needed a little more text here, but if for some reason a student did not have SSI, right, in the past with Medicaid, and then they just started to work and they earned too much, there is a Medicaid buy-in, right? So every state has a Medicaid buy-in. We have one here. It's called Health Benefits for Workers with Disabilities, and it's just what it sounds, right? You get Medicaid because you have a disability, you're earning too much money, and they will charge you a premium, right? And there is a sliding scale of how much premium you will pay based on how much income, earned and unearned income you have. So I apologize, there are a couple more bullet points that didn't make it into that slide, but they will be there before the slides get uploaded. Okay, I was talking with Jim a little bit earlier. Jim said that he had quite a bit of experience writing PASS for students in the past. So Social Security has a little-known feature called a plan to achieve self-support. And what that is it is a way of permitting people receiving SSI to save for a work-related goal in a way that does not disrupt their SSI eligibility. So we already said that people who want to stay eligible for SSI, they can't earn too much, and they can't have too many assets, or what Social Security calls countable resources. They don't call them assets, they call them countable resources. Short definition, accountable resource is pretty much cash or anything that can be easily turned into cash. So checking account, savings account, investment account, right? Bonds, stocks, things like that. The threshold is $2,000, right? It's been $2,000 for decades, which is a very low amount, right? I'm working right now with a student who's struggling because he has 3 different accounts, and when he applied for SSI, we're like, well, at the time of application, did all 3 combined stay under that $2,000 threshold? It's a lot, right, to manage. But with a PASS, you can have more than $2,000, right? But what's ever attributed to the PASS plan is excluded. You can also earn extra income, but the income that's directed into the PASS is excluded for the purposes of eligibility, right? So let's take an example here. So let's take Lucy, a fictitious person, right? So Lucy wants to work as a veterinary assistant, and so she, with help from someone like Jim maybe, creates a PASS, right? And these are the costs that she is going to incur to pursue her goal of becoming a veterinary assistant. So she puts this information into the PASS. She also includes in the PASS a statement of how, once she achieves this goal, she's going to be earning more than she is earning now, meaning she'll cost Social Security less, right? And it has to include a timeline as well, right? So what happens, right? So if you have, in the left side, yes, the longer chart, the left side chart, is when you have only SSI, right? So you have your earned income, right? So if we look at the column where it says without PASS on the left-hand chart, you have your earned income, right? And we haven't contributed to a PASS, so the next line is the same. We get this is assuming this is a person who's over 22, so because the student earned income exclusion is so large that this isn't as useful then. But the person is over 22, or maybe they're not regularly attending school. So they get their first $85 with no reduction to their SSI, then only half of what's left counts, right? So their SSI reduction, right, in that without PASS scenario, would be $250, right? So they would have reduced SSI from working, and it would be a $250 reduction in their SSI. On the column next, where it says with a PASS, they have their earned income, but now they're channeling $300 of their earned income into a PASS, right? So what remains after the PASS is $285. They still get their $85 disregard plus half of the remaining. So now the reduction is much smaller, right? Because channeling that income, that earned income, into the PASS excluded it from the SSI calculation, right? On the right-hand side, I'm not going to go through everything there, but on the right-hand side, people who receive SSDI typically are not eligible for PASS unless using a PASS will make them eligible for SSI, right? And this is a little more complicated. Typically, people who receive SSDI do not also receive SSI because there is a dollar-for-dollar offset, right? So if I am eligible for $1,000 of SSDI, there's a dollar-for-dollar offset, meaning I now have no SSI eligibility because $1,000 of my SSDI is greater than the maximum SSI payable. So typically, people with SSDI are not eligible. Sometimes they are, if their SSDI benefit's smaller, but sometimes with a PASS, you can direct income into that SSDI income into that plan and take it out of the calculation. So this is pretty technical, but the point is PASS can be useful, right? Once a student may be beyond that student earned income exclusion, or even if they're not, right, it could be helpful, depending on their level of earnings, to channel income into the PASS. Similarly, if you put assets into a PASS, like let's say the student only has $1,900 in their bank account, and so they're happily below the $2,000 threshold, but let's say a major holiday rolls around and grandma and grandpa want to give them a chunk of change, so they give them $400. Okay, now, all else equal, they have $2,300 in their bank account. That would make them ineligible for SSI. However, they could take that $400, put it into a PASS if they have one, and now it doesn't count. Okay, so there are a few, the earned income exclusions and the Medicaid continuation apply to SSI. PASS applies mostly to people getting SSI, but can apply to people getting both SSI and SSDI. These now are some work incentives that apply to people receiving SSI or SSDI. The first one is IRWE, impairment-related work expenses, which some of you seem like you might be a bit familiar with. But IRWE, the concept behind IRWE is that sometimes people with disabilities have additional expenses that the rest of the working world does not have. So if there is a good or service that the person needs because of their disability, and they need it in order to work, even if they might use it for a different purpose as well, and they pay for it out of pocket, then it could be an IRWE. So an example of this would be, suppose somebody has a diagnosis of epilepsy, among other things, and let's suppose that they have a service animal, dog probably, and the role of that dog is to alert them when they are about to have a seizure and to guide them to a quiet place so that they can sit down and be safe. Right? So they need the dog because they have a disability, right? Probably, if the employer will permit it, they need the dog to go to work because they could have a seizure at work, right? And if no nonprofit or anybody else is paying for the dog, all the expenses of that service dog could be IRWE. Right? So if people need medication to manage their conditions, if they need to see therapists and those therapists have copays, if they need assistive technology of any sort and that is not paid for by insurance, right? If they need durable medical equipment, if they need particular types of clothing or shoes, orthopedic shoes, for example, if they use augmented communication, right? And that's something that they need. So any of those things can be IRWE. You have to get them approved by Social Security, right? So, and there is not really a form for this. You essentially write them a letter that says, here are my costs. So here's my item or service. Here's why I need it because of my disability. Here's why I need it to go to work. Here's what it costs per month, right? If Social Security approves that, then every month when they look at the earned income, they're going to deduct those impairment-related work expenses first, right? So, okay, so here we go. Right, so without the IRWE, the person has earned income of $1,500. We're not taking any IRWE into account, so they still have $1,500 afterwards because they're not asking for any. They get their $85 disregard, right, for SSI purposes, and then half of what's remaining is earned income. So they have a certain amount of countable earned income, maximum SSI less the countable earned income, right? If they have IRWE, right, they have, and I think I have a calculation wrong in there, so I'll have to go through that. But the short version is when they have IRWE, they have less countable earned income because before they go through this calculation, they have deducted, right, they have deducted the IRWE from their income. If they have SSDI, right, so SSDI works a little differently from SSI. With SSDI, you don't have an immediate reduction if you earn income. With SSDI, as long as you don't exceed the level that constitutes substantial gainful activity, you still receive your SSDI. Now, substantial gainful activity, just to refresh, is $1,620 a month for 2025. So in the second example, right, the right-hand example, if a person was earning $1,700 a month and did not have any IRWI, they would be ineligible for their SSDI because they have exceeded the substantial gainful activity level. However, if they take IRWI into account, now they're below that $1,620 threshold, so now they are eligible. So those can be valuable. Other work incentives, and this is one that can really be reassuring to parents, both SSI and SSDI have expedited reinstatement, right? So if a student goes through substantial training and even, say, an apprenticeship program, and they go and they are no longer receiving SSI because they earn too much, or if for whatever reason they were receiving SSDI and they earn too much, but then something happens, right? Their disabling conditions worsen, right? Let's say it's a progressive situation, like MS or something, or it's an episodic condition like a behavioral health condition, right? Or maybe they had supports in their employment and those supports go away for some reason because, let's say, the really good manager you had who understood everything moves on and the person they bring in does not have that same level of understanding, right? And they lose their job. So there is expedited reinstatement, right? So if their income is above the level where they're eligible for benefits, but then it drops down, either because of their disability, the situation, the same conditions get worse, or because they had special circumstances that they no longer have, right? They are eligible for expedited reinstatement. Now with SSI, assuming that the person has been reporting their earned income on an ongoing basis, and I will step back for a minute and say, I should have said this up front. Once a student begins to work, if they are receiving SSI or SSDI, they need to report their earned income to Social Security, starting as soon as they start earning. This is really, really, really important. There is an app for reporting if it's SSI. The app, for some reasons I don't understand, only applies for SSI, not SSDI. But if you can't use the app, there is a phone reporting line, or you can upload pay stubs to your My Social Security, or the students can upload to their My Social Security account, or they can take the old-fashioned route of mailing them in, but please use a method where you can track the mail, or fax. Social Security is one of the few organizations that still operates using fax machines, so you can do that as well. But with SSI, assuming the student is reporting income on an ongoing basis, right, then once their income drops, so you don't, if your medical condition does not improve, right, and Social Security will maintain your eligibility for SSI, right? If they don't make a medical determination that you have improved, right? If that does not happen, but due to earned income, you stop receiving your SSI payable, and then because of your worsening disabling conditions or because of supports being removed, you fall below the level where, and that makes you eligible again, your SSI will resume. And I've seen this happen, even for people who are long beyond the student stage of life. For SSDI, if you have SSDI and you have gone through, and there's kind of multiple stages of evaluation, but if you have gone through those and you have lost your SSDI due to earned income, and you then fall below the threshold within 5 years, you can have expedited restatement. If you miss the 5-year window, you're going to have to reapply. So they do operate a little bit differently. But expedited reinstatement is there, right? So that's a safety net. Okay. These work incentives apply to people who receive SSDI and not to SSI. Now, in most cases, your students would not be receiving SSDI. However, there are two possibilities which will show up in the examples that come a little bit later. One is that the student has been working and has earned enough work credits because as a young person, under the age of 24, which would be anybody in transition, they only need 6 credits, not the 40 that we all need for retirement. They only need 6 credits to be eligible for SSDI. So particularly for students who have those really ambitious go-getter parents that try to set them up to get work experience right away, or maybe have a family business, they might have those credits in place. And then when they go at 18 to apply, they might have enough credits to be eligible for SSDI. Or there is a form of SSDI that is based on a parent's work record, whereby if you have a disability that starts before the age of 22, and your parent starts drawing Social Security for either disability, retirement, or if they pass away, then you, the young adult child, are eligible for a benefit based on a parent's work record. It's technically called either a childhood disability benefit or a disabled adult child benefit. It is a slightly distinct category, but it operates exactly like SSDI. So for students who might have older parents, or for students who might have been, for example, legally adopted by a grandparent, that could be a situation. So some students might conceivably have SSDI. So we'll go very briefly through the work incentives that apply for those. Even if they don't, though, it's helpful for parents to know because at some point their student will, particularly if they're working, they will transition from SSI to SSDI. Why? Because as they work, they accumulate credits. Once they have enough credits for their age, they will transition to SSDI from SSI. So it is kind of important that at least there's some awareness from school staff and parents that even when you move to SSDI, there are additional work incentives. The first thing to understand with SSDI or a benefit that a student might be receiving based on a parent's work record is that there is a multi-stage evaluation for continuing to get that cash benefit. So for SSI, it's pretty simple in a way. You get SSI, you start to work, you lose 50 cents for every dollar you earn approximately, and if you earn enough, that formula reduces your SSI benefit payable to 0. And then if something changes and your income goes down, the benefit comes back, right? SSDI is different. There is a multi-stage evaluation. The first stage is called the trial work period, right? And this applies regardless of age, regardless of student status, right? So if a student is, for whatever reason, receiving SSDI or an SSDI-like benefit based on a parent's work record, this would be how it works, right? So during the trial work period, the student can earn as much as they can, right? There's no limit, but every time they exceed the trial work threshold, a box is checked off that says you have 1 trial work month. So for this year, and what makes this a little complicated is there's different thresholds. Substantial gainful activity is 1,620. Trial work is 1,160. It's enough to remember that it's, generally speaking, it's quite a bit lower. So students would first, Social Security would track, are you earning more than the trial work level or not? And every time they earn more, they would check a box, right? Once you have 9 boxes checked in a 5-year or 60-month period, you're done with the trial work, right? Now that could happen if the student, for example, is going through the apprenticeship program, depending on how much they're earning, that could happen really fast, right? It might happen in 9 straight months, depending on their level of earnings, right? Or if they're working on a more part-time level basis, right, it might go up and down. Trial work month, not trial work month. Trial work month, not trial work month, depending on how their wages go. But once you have 9 trial work months in the 60-month period, you're done with your first stage evaluation of do you get to keep your SSDI benefits. Subsequently, there's a 36-month period where they compare the earned income against that higher threshold, which is the general disability threshold, substantial gainful activity, which is 1,620. That is a 36-month or 3-year consecutive period. During that period, they get paid if they make less than the substantial gainful activity level, and they don't get paid if they make more, right? So it can go on and off, on and off, on and off, on and off. Once you get to the end of that 36-month period, if you're still earning above the substantial gainful activity level, guess what? Congratulations, you don't have a disability anymore, you're done, right? Unless within 5 years, your income drops. So that's a lot, but the short version is, for SSDI recipients, students who might be getting that type of benefit, parents do not have to worry that if their student starts earning too much, they will just drop off a cliff. There is a period when they will be evaluated, and the shortest that period can be is 3 years and 9 months, right? So there is a period during which they can work with a benefits consultant, they can understand the process, and they can make an informed choice. Does my student go to work full-time, and at the end of those 3 years and 9 months give up their SSDI eligibility? Or is that not realistic for a sustained track for my student? And do we keep them working part-time because we know that they're not gonna be able to work sustained at that level for the rest of their lives? Okay. Other work incentives that will apply to people who receive SSDI. This one's kind of cool. So employers are required to make reasonable accommodations for employees, right? That's in the law, and I think someone said earlier, reasonable accommodation is generally something that might not cost the employer more than a couple $100s, right? That's not that difficult to implement, but they are required to make reasonable accommodations. To the extent that the employer provides accommodations to the student or the young adult who's working, and because of those accommodations, the student or the worker is less productive than another person with the same job title, but no accommodations, the employer is subsidizing the wage that they're paying, right? So they're paying two people the same amount of money, but one person has accommodations and effectively does somewhat less work than the other person, but they're being paid the same. That's the thought process there. So an example of this, it's a little bit easier with an example. So again, let's say you have an employee with a disability, and let's say they're working in a retail situation, but they are exempted from working in the stock room loading and unloading boxes because they have a restriction on how much they can lift, right? Other associates at that same store are required to do that work when it's available, but the student with a disability or the person with a disability is not because they physically can't do it. Right? So because they're exempted, they are less productive from another associate that does not have that exemption, right? Or if a person has a disability that causes them to tire more easily, like a neuromuscular disability, right? So they are permitted to take additional breaks. So they're not as productive because guess what? They're on break more of the time. Right? Or the employee with a disability may be permitted to work at a slower rate. Right? That may be an acceptable accommodation. There is a form for this, right? So there's no form for impairment-related work expenses, but there is a form for employer subsidy, and it can be helpful because what happens is the employer, it's a pretty simple form, they check off some boxes. This employee has fewer duties, or more oversight, or additional help, or less hours, right? So there's boxes they can choose from, and then the next section says, essentially, because of this, this employee is 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, or don't know why they have this in, 100% as productive as another employee, right? And they check a box. And so if the employer attests by checking that box that this student is 80% as productive as another person who's in the same job but has no accommodations, Social Security mostly has to accept the employer's statement that that's the case. Guess what? They'll only count 80% of the student's or the worker's income, right? So the employer has said, I'm getting 80% of the work. I'm paying 100%, but I'm getting 80%. So Social Security says, well, their effective level of employment is only 80%. So we're only going to count 80% of their earned income. Now, the person still gets their full paycheck, but Social Security only counts 80% when they're considering whether they are eligible for SSDI or not. This employer subsidy only applies in SSI cases at initial application, which is why I didn't include it there. Once you're past initial application, this does not affect SSI at all. So it can help at the beginning if the student is working at such a high level at the beginning. But more things that apply to SSDI, not so common, right? If a person is self-employed, some families are interested in starting micro businesses, right? Their student might have a micro business, family might buy them a shredder, and they might do shredding work or something like that. If to the extent that somebody else pays for the stuff they need to start the business, for example, buys them a shredder, ordinarily, if I start a business and I purchase equipment to start my business, that equipment is a business expense to me. If the person with a disability starts a business and it would have been a business expense to them, except somebody else pays for it, they can still deduct it for Social Security purposes. Not for IRS purposes, I will say, okay, but for Social Security purposes. It's not that well used, but it's there. And this is one that could be important. Typically, people that get SSDI after 24 months will become eligible for Medicare, right? And if they work enough to lose their SSDI eligibility, right, they will eventually lose their Medicare eligibility. However, there is a process for continuing their Medicare eligibility even after they stop receiving their SSDI checks. So there's about a 93-month period when you get Medicare just as if you were still getting your check. And then after that, if you still need Medicare, there's a Medicare buy-in. Similar to the Medicaid buy-in, there's a Medicare buy-in where you can self-pay the Medicare premiums. Okay, so this is something that maybe I should have front-loaded this slide a little bit earlier because it explains what typically happens in the life of a student's benefits. So most students, when they first apply at 18 in that light blue box, right, most students have no work experience, so they're only eligible for SSI, so that's what they get. Gets confusing because you apply and you're considered to have applied for both. Typically, they're only eligible for SSI because they don't have enough work credits, right? Then, if the transition program is doing what it's designed to do, they might start working. Either while they're still in school, they start working and earning income, or certainly when they leave school, right? Then they start accumulating those Social Security credits. Then they might receive SSDI because they have enough credits. Sometimes they might be receiving both, depending on how much SSDI and how much work income, right? And so then if they continue meeting the definition of disability and a parent retires, they will then be eligible for a benefit on the parent's work record. Whether they get SSDI on their own work record or they get it because a parent retires or goes on disability, they will have Medicare. So they start out with SSI. If they do it right, they apply for Medicaid, they have SSI and Medicaid together. They start working, they build credits. They get SSDI, they get Medicare after 24 months. Parent retires, they get an additional eligibility based on the parent's work record, right? So that's kind of the flow. In some cases, some students will need to maintain their eligibility for some of these benefits all the way through, right? So an example of this, and this is particularly on the Medicaid side. So an example of this that is a real life example, where I won't share any names, but I'm aware of a woman, not so young anymore, long outside of school, but she is quite a good worker, right? She's one of those workers that employers love. She works at a grocery store. She works a lot of hours. Why? Because she's reliable, she knows the job, she shows up, she's willing to take other shifts on short notice that other people don't want. And she does great, right? So she is not eligible for any SSDI payable anymore because her earned income is too high, right? However, she lives at home with a parent. The parent is aging, right? While she's living at home with the parent, she's pretty independent, right? She goes to and from work by herself because she can walk there. If it's raining, she can take the bus, right? She knows that route. She can, prepare some food for herself, some real small, dishes, simple dishes on the stove, maybe microwave some stuff. If you give her a grocery list and a certain amount of money, she can go to the store and buy those items. She can do some basic cleaning. She's really good at laundry, right? But, right, if something unexpected happened, if she were to get sick and need medical attention, right? She does not know how to call her doctors or set up an appointment. She could certainly not get herself to an emergency room. If there was a weather emergency, she wouldn't know necessarily what to do. She can't pay her own bills, right? So if her phone bill is on auto pay, that's great. If for some reason she doesn't have enough money in her account and that doesn't go through, she doesn't know what to do, right? So right now, the parent is providing all of that unpaid support. But what happens when that parent goes into assisted living or skilled nursing or dies, right? There is no other parent. There is a sibling, but the sibling has his own life and can't be there on a moment-to-moment on-call basis. What happens at that point? That young woman who's, middle-aged woman, almost middle-aged, who is really good at her job and doing fine with her earned income will need somebody from a provider agency to step in and provide her that support on a paid basis. And the provider agency is going to want to know, okay, she's an emergency situation because dad just passed away. Yes, we will take her on and we'll provide a worker to come to her house and whatever, or we'll help her to move into one of our group homes. However, if she doesn't have Medicaid, the provider's not going to take her. Why? Because that's how they get paid. And even her earnings from Jewel are not going to cover the $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year, depending on how far out we're looking, that the provider needs to provide support for even someone with relatively low support needs. Right? It's remarkably expensive because you have to pay the DSPs, and you have to train them, and you have to provide them health insurance, and you have to provide overall insurance, right? And there's transportation and all these other factors, right? So in that case, that person still needs to maintain their eligibility for some of those benefits. So another example might be a person who's employed, as some people with disabilities are employed with an industry that is where the jobs are somewhat volatile, right? So we've all seen this, like in retail, right? So what happened in the pandemic to the brick and mortar stores? People stopped coming. Everybody got everything on Amazon, right? Nobody was going to go out. Grocery stores, yes, but some of the other stores, right, the jobs in that went way down, right? People's hours got cut. They might have gotten laid off because there was no work for them, right? So if a person is employed in that field, right, but then they lose their job, right, then they need access to those benefits again. Or if their disabling condition continues, or they get older themselves and, like the rest of us, want to retire, right? So sometimes we need to look forward and say, now things are good, but we want to make sure that if the situation changes, we want to take advantage of them working to their full potential now, but we want to make sure that if things change in the future, this person has the safeguards they need. So we're going to take a quick look, and I'm really out of time. So very quickly, just to run through an example, and I'll go through the SSI one probably because that's the easiest one. So we'll take Mark as a student, right? He is a student in his year of transition. He starts an unpaid internship. He has SSI, but he's not earning any income, so guess what? Nothing happens, right? He goes out of school. Now he's earning $600 a month, but because of the formula for SSI, he does get less SSI, but he only loses 50 cents on the dollar, so he's still better off financially, and he's building those credits for SSDI, right? One more and then I'll stop. So Dana, she gets a paid internship while she's in school, but because she is a student regularly attending school and there's that student earned income exclusion, she's fine, and her SSI is not affected, right? And she's, again, building those credits. When she graduates, right, she has built enough credits that she's actually eligible for SSDI. So now she's got earned income and SSDI income and possibly some SSI income. So I should stop because I've run a little bit over. I'm going to take some questions if anybody has any and is willing to hang around for a few extra minutes. And I think, yeah, Jim's going to run the microphone so everybody can hear.
Test.
Thank you. I was a little worried you weren't going to have time. I did write it down. I work for DRS. And my question to you is, when a customer signs their IPE with DRS, that assigns their ticket to work to DRS.
It does.
Right?
It does. Yeah, that's true.
So my question is, once they assign their ticket to work to DRS, does that mean that their milestones begin to start? Like you mentioned that they have to meet some milestones. My question is...
The initial ones do. Now, it is a long process, and there are multiple milestones, and I think as we're aware that with DRS, once, and I don't want to misspeak here, but once a person is employed, there's a certain period of time that DRS continues, but if the person stays employed, at that point the case is closed.
Right.
Once the case is closed, they will still have a number of milestones remaining on their ticket, and they can assign that to a nonprofit agency or another employment network provider.
Okay, thank you. I have another question.
Sure.
You said that once the student turns 18, the parent, if they've done everything right, they should go and apply for Medicaid.
Well, for
Medicaid.
SSI first and then Medicaid, because it helps to have the SSI determination. But
So
yeah.
my question is, does HFS consider a Medicaid application for a young person at the age of 18 as an application for a family of one because they're an adult, or does the parent have to complete a Medicaid application for a family or for the mom and dad?
So that is a good question, and the short answer is either or, but it depends on how you explain it. So in Illinois, as in many states, there are multiple eligibility categories that a person with a disability can fall into, right? So before the ACA expansion, when the only category for a person with a disability over the age of 18 was the disability category, they were enrolled in that category, and that category is it's non-integrated with the tax code, so it only considers that person's own income. With the expansion under the ACA, we now had a whole different category of low-income adults, and that category takes into account the entire, what they call tax household's income. So if the student is claimed, their whole family's income would be included. Obvious solution to this would be to say, well, just make sure my student is enrolled under the disability category. What happens in practice, though, is that when they apply, the folks taking the application are going to try to plug them into the Affordable Care Act category first. Why? Because the federal reimbursement contribution to the ACA category is 90% of the cost, and it's only 51% of the disability category. So essentially, Illinois is motivated to put more people in the Affordable Care Act category because they get more federal dollar match for that. So the challenge is that if you're aware of this, and you don't want the family's income involved, the family has to make sure that they probably have to ask to make sure that their person is enrolled in the right category, which is unfortunate, but true.
One more question.
Yeah, and then we have someone back there too. so it's okay. You could ask. I don't want to cut anybody out, but I realize I talked a little bit too long.
So when you talked about the PASS program, so is that something that as a parent I work with my Social Security counselor or my DRS counselor, or are they the same thing?
Well, if you have a reliable Social Security person, kudos to you, because most people don't have one that sort of they get whoever they get.
We do. We're very lucky.
Okay, and DRS, it's not a DRS thing. It is a Social Security
Okay.
thing. So you would want to work with your person at Social Security. As far as I'm aware, there is or used to be a form for that, but it's
Okay.
like 17 pages long. So you need to go through and fill in all of the items. Now, you can go and find somebody like whatever Jim's role was at the time when he was doing that. People are available to help with that. So work incentives folks, WIPA, work incentives, planning assistance people, if you can get a hold of one. There are other people that have benefits counseling background can help you go through that form and make sure that everything's in there that needs to be.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
You mentioned that, and I had a parent, actually, was very sharp, that said, Maria, I need my son working because I need him to get those 6 credits so that he could move to SSDI. And at that time, which was over 15 years ago, I was like, what? I didn't even know about that. But anyway, now I know. I just want to make sure I understand. You said the individual under age 24 and they're working, they only need to earn 6 credits to be eligible for SSDI, correct?
Correct. And
What
sorry,
does 6 credits mean? Is
so
it 1 year, 3
right
years,
now,
5
so it
years?
changes a little bit every year and credits just for people who are, credits used to be called quarters or quarters of coverage, and now they're called quarters of credit, or anyway, same idea. You get a Social Security credit for this year, $1,810 you earn. So it'd be nice if all of these levels were like the same number, but they're not. So for every $1,810 in gross earnings, anybody who works gets 1 Social Security credit. You can get up to 4 in a calendar year. You can't get more than that. So even if you earn like $10,000, it's not going to get you beyond those 4 credits. For a young person under the age of 24, they only need 6. Technically, it's 6 within the 3 years prior to their application to be fully insured for SSDI. So yes, some parents who are very on top of this say, I want my student to accumulate those credits early on, because the younger you are, the fewer you need. As you go past 24, the older you get, the more you need. Yeah.
Okay, so I fall into the category with a lot of parents who they don't want their child to go to work because they're afraid of losing. So what I'm hearing you say is I can go into my meeting and say, do the Social Security, get the Medicaid, go work while you can, but it'll be there essentially afterward. Like if you get it, if you're accepted, then the likelihood of being able to get back to it without starting all over and everything will be there?
It is there. Now, I wouldn't say unequivocally under all circumstances, right? But what I would want parents to understand is that it is a gradual process. It is not an immediate, like they start working and boom, they lose their eligibility, right? So for SSI, typically they're going to maintain their eligibility, but they're going to see a reduced benefit. If they get to a point where they're consistently earning so much that their benefit was reduced to 0, Social Security may decide to do a reevaluation, right? But for most students, if they're working at a part-time level, they're going to see a reduced benefit. The SSI eligibility will remain. Even if they get to the point where they're working so much it goes to 0 for a period of time, it would be possible for them to get that reinstated. So I had that's even for an adult, where a person he had an episodic type disability, and he was doing just fine and making $50,000 a year for a while, but then things kicked in, and he couldn't do that any longer, and he got back on SSI without applying again. So I would say the best thing to do is just to reassure parents that there is a process. It can be managed. It is not an instantaneous thing that they're going to lose their benefits when they start working, and that there are people out there, So people like me can help with this. If they work with an attorney, often an attorney can help with that. WIPA folks can help with this. So, just say that there are people who can help guide you through this to make sure that you and your student understand the rules.
Thank you, Alexandra. Yep.